Imagine a world without the king of rock and roll. In that world, Elvis Presley might have remained nothing more than a shy truck driver, a man with a nice voice, but ultimately lost. So, what transformed that driver into a revolution? It wasn't just the voice, it was a specific weapon: Scotty Moore's guitar. Scotty built the throne for the king. Yet in a cruel twist of irony, while the king ruled the world, the architect was cast into the shadows. From defining the sound of an entire century to being forced to sell his most cherished memorabilia in his final years. Why is the music industry so ruthless to the very people who built it? This is the untold story of Scotty Moore, the man who changed everything, only to be met with silence. Scotty Moore was not a fuse that burned fast. He was slow, deliberate, and composed of a material that the world of celebrity would eventually find impossible to digest: dignity. He was carved from the red dirt of Gadsden, Tennessee. Born in 1931, in the depth of the Great Depression, he was raised in a landscape where silence was the default setting. It was a world of mule-drawn plows, porch swings, and the kind of crushing rural isolation that forces a boy to look inward. He was the youngest of 4 boys. In a farming family, music wasn't a career, it was a utility. It was what you did when the sun went down and there was no money for the cinema. His father played the banjo. His brothers played the fiddle. Scotty picked up the guitar not to be a star, but to be part of the conversation. But there was a precision in Scotty, even then, that set him apart from the frantic strumming of the front porch jamborees. He listened. He listened to the radio signals drifting in from Nashville and Chicago. He heard the jazz guitarist Tal Farlow, and more importantly, he heard Chet Atkins. Atkins didn't just strum chords. He played the melody and the rhythm at the same time, his thumb acting as the bass player while his fingers danced the lead. It was a self-contained system. It was efficient. This obsession with efficiency would define Scotty's life. He wasn't a showman. He didn't want to jump around. He wanted to make the machine work. As a teenager, Scotty joined the U.S. Navy, and the routine of service left him calm, precise, and allergic to drama. This is the crucial, often overlooked key to his psychology. While Elvis Presley was growing up mama's boy in the protected housing projects of Memphis, Scotty Moore was scrubbing decks in the Yellow Sea. He served in the U.S. Navy during the Korean War era, and the discipline of military life shaped the way he worked. He lived for 4 years in the rigid, hierarchical world of the military, where individuality is a liability and executing your duty is the only currency that matters. The Navy stripped away the rural slowness and replaced it with a mechanic's discipline. You keep your uniform pressed, you keep your weapon clean, you keep your mouth shut unless you have something to say. When he was discharged in 1952, Scotty Moore was a man formed. He was stoic, reliable, and practically allergic to drama. He moved to Memphis not to become famous, but to work. He got a job at his brother's dry cleaning business. He spent his days surrounded by the hiss of steam presses and the smell of chemicals. It was hot, repetitive work. It was the life of a common man in the post-war South. But the guitar was still there. It was his escape hatch. Memphis in the early 1950s was a city on the verge of a nervous breakdown. It was a segregated city, strictly divided by the color line, yet the airwaves were bleeding together. White kids were listening to black blues on WDIA. Black kids were hearing country twang. The tension was palpable. It was a city of migrants, of country boys coming to town to work in the factories, bringing their fiddles and their prejudices with them. Scotty formed a band called the Starlight Wranglers. They were a hillbilly outfit, competent, professional, and utterly unexceptional. They wore matching outfits, cowboy hats and string ties, playing the honky-tonks for drunk factory workers. They played the hits of the day, Hank Williams, Eddie Arnold, the safe stuff. The bass player was a man named Bill Black. Bill was the clown to Scotty's straight man. Bill was a neighbor of Scotty's, a man with a slap-happy grin and a beat-up upright bass. He wasn't a virtuoso, but he had a sense of rhythm that was infectious. Together, they were a solid rhythm section looking for a reason to exist. They were missing one thing, a voice. The singer for the Starlight Wranglers was Doug Poindexter, a man with a nasal, traditional country voice that was going out of style faster than he realized. Scotty knew it. He could feel the ground shifting beneath them. The crowds were getting younger. They didn't want waltzes anymore. They wanted a beat. Scotty began to haunt the Sun studio. He struck up a relationship with Sam Phillips, a man who possessed a visionary madness that fascinated the pragmatic Scotty. Phillips was looking for something he couldn't describe. He kept talking about a black sound from a white singer. He talked about rhythm. He talked about the feel. Scotty, ever the hustler for work, kept asking Sam, "You got anybody? You hear anybody?" And finally, on a humid Saturday in late June 1954, Sam's secretary, Marion Kiesker, reminded him of the kid with the sideburns, the kid who had come in a year ago to record a demo for his mother, the kid who worked at Crown Electric. "He's got a ballad voice," Sam told Scotty over the phone. "Might be worth a listen." Scotty took the number. He didn't know he was holding the combination to a vault. He was just looking for a singer who could help him get out of the dry cleaning plant. Mythology likes to place the first meeting at the studio, but history tells us it happened in a living room. In early July 1954, Elvis came over to Scotty's place in Memphis for an informal tryout. The contrast between the two men could not have been more stark. Scotty was 22, but he was a married man, a veteran, a business owner, wearing a button-down shirt. Elvis was 19, wearing pink slacks with a black stripe, a lace shirt, and hair that was greased into a defiant ducktail. He was painfully shy, mumbling "yes, sir," and "no, sir," twisting his hat in his hands. Scotty wasn't impressed by the plumage. He was a Navy man. He judged men by their utility. "Well, let's hear what you got," Scotty said. Elvis picked up his guitar and began to sing. He sang the only things he felt safe singing, ballads. He sang Bing Crosby. He sang Billy Eckstine. He sang Hank Snow. Scotty sat there, listening intently, his face a mask of neutral judgment. The kid had a voice, certainly. It was a strange voice, high and tremulous, with a fast vibrato that sounded like a nervous bird. But it wasn't commanding. It was polite. It was safe. When Elvis left, Scotty turned to Bill Black, who had dropped by to listen. "What do you think?" Scotty asked. Bill lit a cigarette and shrugged. "He sounds like everybody else on the radio. He's okay, but he didn't knock me out." Scotty nodded. He called Sam Phillips the next morning. "The boy is good," Scotty reported in his flat, honest drawl. "He's got a good voice, but I don't know if he's what you're looking for. He sings like a bird." Sam Phillips, perhaps out of desperation, perhaps out of instinct, said, "Bring him in anyway." We returned to the night of July 5th, 1954. The studio, the heat, the boredom. For 3 hours, the session was a disaster. Sam Phillips was trying to record a ballad called "I Love You Because." It was a dirge. Elvis was terrified. He was stiff, trying to hit the notes perfectly, trying to be the professional singer he thought they wanted. Scotty and Bill were playing along, painting by numbers. It was music for a funeral parlor. Sam Phillips called for a break. He went into the booth to change the tape reel, likely thinking about how he was going to tell the kid to go back to driving a truck. Elvis put his guitar down and wiped the sweat from his forehead. Scotty took a sip of a Coke. The silence in the room was heavy with failure. And then The kinetic energy of youth took over. Elvis, bored and nervous, picked his guitar back up. He didn't play the ballad. He started hacking away at an old blues song by Arthur Big Boy Crudup called That's All Right. But he didn't play it like a blues song. He played it fast. He played it like he was frantic. He started jumping around the small room, acting the fool, shaking his legs. Bill Black, seeing the tension break, grabbed his bass. "Well, that's just fine," he laughed, and he started slapping the strings, creating a percussive, clicking rhythm that sounded like a train coming off the tracks. And then Scotty Moore made the decision that defined his legacy. A lesser guitarist would have stopped. A lesser guitarist would have told the singer to shut up and be professional. A country guitarist would have tried to strum along. But Scotty Moore did something else. He listened. In that split second, his brain, the brain of the mechanic, the architect, analyzed the chaos. He realized there were no drums. He realized the sound was thin. It needed weight. It needed a counterpoint. He didn't strum. He leaned into his Gibson ES 295 and began to play a lead line that was impossible to categorize. It utilized the Merle Travis picking style, thumb on the bass notes, fingers on the melody, but he played it with a stinging electric aggression. He played around the vocal, weaving in and out of Elvis's voice like a needle through fabric. Sam Phillips stuck his head out of the booth. The look on his face wasn't anger, it was shock. "What are you doing?" Sam yelled. "We don't know," Scotty yelled back, stopping the guitar. "Well, back up," Sam commanded, his eyes wide. "Try to find a place to start and do it again." They did it again. Sam hit record. "Listen to the track today. Really listen to it. You hear Elvis? Yes. You hear the youth, the sex, the freedom, but listen to the guitar. It is the spine of the creature." Without drums, Scotty Moore is carrying the rhythm, the melody, and the harmony all at once. He is playing with a clean, sharp tone that cuts through the mix. There's a solo in the middle of the song. It is simple, yet profound. It doesn't scream, it announces. It says the old world is over. This is the new machine. When they finished the take, they listened to the playback. They huddled around the speaker. For the first time in history, the Elvis sound filled the room. It wasn't country. It wasn't blues. It was something that didn't have a name yet. Sam Phillips was ecstatic. He knew he had lightning in a bottle. But Scotty Moore, leaning against the wall, lighting a cigarette, felt something else. He felt a shift in the gravity of the room. He looked at Elvis. The boy was no longer the shy truck driver. He was vibrating. He was listening to his own voice with a look of narcissistic wonder. Scotty Moore, the man who had just provided the structural integrity for this new sound, packed his guitar into its case. He didn't know it yet, but he had just built the throne for a king. And as is the way with builders, once the castle is finished, they are often asked to use the servants' entrance. He drove home that night to his wife and his job at the dry cleaners. The radio in his car was playing the old songs, Patti Page, Perry Como. He looked out at the dark streets of Memphis. He knew with the intuition of a man who watches the weather that a storm was coming. He just didn't know that the storm would eventually blow him away. The explosion didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a nuclear detonation that instantly leveled the landscape. It was a slow-moving brush fire that started in the grassy fields of Memphis and gradually consumed the South. And in the center of that fire, driving the car, tuning the guitars, and counting the gas money, was Scotty Moore. If part one was the story of the spark, part two is the story of the fuel. It is the story of three men in a car, conquering the world one high school gymnasium at a time, and the shadow that arrived to tear them apart. On July 6, 1954, the sun rose over Memphis, just as hot and indifferent as it had the day before. Elvis Presley went back to his job at Crown Electric, pushing a broom and wrestling with heavy cables. Scotty Moore went back to the University Park Cleaners, breathing in the fumes of perchloroethylene. To the outside observer, nothing had changed. But inside Sam Phillips's head, the gears were turning. He took the acetate disc of That's All Right to Dewey Phillips, no relation, the wildest DJ in Memphis. Dewey played it on WHBQ that very night. He didn't just play it, he played it repeatedly. The switchboard lit up. Callers were confused. Is he black? Is he white? What does that sound? Scotty listened to the broadcast from a radio at his aunt's house. He heard the music, his guitar cutting through the static, and he heard the reaction. When Dewey interviewed Elvis later that night, asking the boy which high school he attended, a coded way to reveal his race to the audience without saying it, Scotty realized the magnitude of the social line they had just crossed. But realization doesn't pay the rent. In those first fragile weeks, Scotty Moore became the de facto manager of the enterprise. Elvis was a child in the eyes of the law and the world. He had no car, no money, and no business sense. Scotty was the veteran. He was the one who booked their first gig at the Bon Air Club. He was the one who loaded the gear into his 1951 Chevy Bel Air. They called themselves the Blue Moon Boys. It was a name that sounded innocent, almost quaint, like a doo-wop group or a country trio, but the sound they made was a violation of the peace. There is a specific intimacy that develops between men who travel together in a cramped space for thousands of miles. It is a bond forged in boredom, bad food, and the shared vulnerability of sleep. For the next 18 months, Scotty Moore, Elvis Presley, and Bill Black lived in the cabin of a car, first the Chevy, then a used 1955 Crown Victoria, and eventually a pink Cadillac. But in the beginning, it was just the Chevy. Picture the scene. It is 2 a.m. on a 2-lane blacktop in rural Arkansas. The headlights cut a weak tunnel through the darkness. Bill Black is snoring in the back seat, his upright bass taking up half the space, the neck of the instrument poking between the front seats like a wooden passenger. Elvis is in the passenger seat, staring out the window, twitching with adrenaline, talking a mile a minute about girls, about comic books, about dreams. And Scotty is driving, always driving. He was the designated adult. He was the one who made sure they got to the gig on time. He was the one who dealt with the mechanics when the radiator blew. He was the one who kept Elvis grounded. When Elvis would get too high on the crowd's reaction, Scotty would be there with a quiet word, a cigarette, and a reminder that they still had to drive 300 miles before dawn. This period, late 1954 to late 1955, was the golden age of their brotherhood. There were no bodyguards, there were no colonels, there were no private jets. It was us against them. They were invading hostile territory, and it was hostile. We forget that rock and roll was not welcomed with open arms. It was viewed as a virus. When they played the Grand Ole Opry in October 1954, the reception was icy. The Opry was the Vatican of country music, and the Blue Moon Boys were heretics. They played Blue Moon of Kentucky at a breakneck speed. The audience sat on their hands. After the show, the Opry's talent manager, Jim Denny, famously told Elvis, "Boy, you ought to go back to driving a truck." Elvis cried on the way home. He was crushed. It was Scotty who stiffened his spine. Scotty, the man who had been rejected by the establishment his whole life, drove the car in silence for a while, then said, "To hell with them, Elvis. We don't need them. We've got something they don't understand." It was a pivotal moment. If Scotty had agreed with the establishment, Elvis might have quit. Instead, they turned the car south, toward the Louisiana hayride, the rebellious younger cousin of the Opry. The hayride embraced them. The revolution found its headquarters. Musically, this era was a marvel of improvisation. In the studio, Sam Phillips could use slapback echo to make the trio sound huge. On stage in a drafty gymnasium in Texas with a terrible PA system, they were naked. There were no drums yet. DJ Fontana wouldn't join permanently until 1955. It was just one acoustic guitar, one electric guitar, and a bass. Scotty Moore had to become a sonic magician. He developed a style of playing that filled every frequency. He used his thumb to thump the bass notes, locking in with Bill Black to create a driving, percussive rhythm. His fingers picked the melody and the fills simultaneously. He played chords that were thick and jazzy, adding sophistication to Elvis's three-chord progressions. But his most important role was as the anchor. As the months went on, Elvis began to discover his power. The hillbilly cat persona emerged. The leg shaking, which started as a nervous tic, became a weapon of mass seduction. Elvis would fall to his knees. He would roll on the floor. He would thrust his hips at the microphone stand. The girls in the front row would lose their minds. The screaming would reach a pitch that drowned out the music. In the middle of this hurricane stood Scotty Moore. He stood to the right of Elvis, legs slightly apart, guitar held high on his chest, face impassive. He never grimaced. He never jumped. He watched Elvis with the eyes of a hawk. If Elvis missed a beat, which he often did in his frenzy, Scotty would seamlessly adjust the rhythm to catch him. If Elvis forgot a verse, Scotty would play a fill to cover the gap. He was the safety net. Elvis could fly as high as he wanted because he knew instinctively that Scotty Moore would catch him. But success attracts predators. By 1955, the regional brush fire was becoming a national inferno. The records were selling. The crowds were getting dangerous. Scotty, who had technically been the manager in the early days, had handed the reins over to a local DJ named Bob Neal. Neal was a decent man, but he was a small-time operator. He was a fishing boat captain trying to steer an ocean liner. Enter Colonel Tom Parker. He wasn't a colonel. He wasn't even Tom Parker. He was a Dutch illegal immigrant named Andreas Cornelis van Kuyk. He was a former carnival barker, a man who had made a living painting sparrows yellow to sell them as canaries. He was a man of immense girth, with eyes that assessed every human interaction as a transaction. Parker saw Elvis Presley not as a musician, but as an attraction, a geek in a sideshow, a phenomenon. And he saw Scotty and Bill not as partners, but as overhead. The tragedy of Scotty Moore is that he was a man of honor operating in a world of sharks. He believed that a handshake meant something. He believed that loyalty was currency. When Colonel Parker began to circle the camp in 1955, offering his services as a special advisor, Scotty was wary, but he trusted Elvis. And Elvis, overwhelmed by the chaos of his own life, was easily seduced by the Colonel's promises of Hollywood and gold. The wedge was driven slowly. First, Parker insisted that business discussions be held only with Elvis and his parents. The boys were asked to wait outside. Then Parker began to complain about the expenses. Why were they splitting the money this way? Why does the guitar player have a say in the bookings? The defining moment of the shift occurred in November 1955. The Sun Records contract was sold to RCA Victor for $35,000, an astronomical sum at the time. Sam Phillips, the man who started it all, cashed out. He needed the money to save his business. He sold his discovery. When the move to RCA happened, the dynamic changed instantly. At Sun, they were a family experimenting in a lab. At RCA, they were units of production in a factory. In January 1956, the Blue Moon Boys walked into the RCA studios in Nashville. The atmosphere was sterile. Corporate executives in suits stood behind the glass, checking their watches. They were skeptical. They thought RCA had overpaid for a fad. They wanted a hit, and they wanted it fast. Elvis was nervous. The intimacy of Sun was gone. He looked at Scotty. What do we do? Scotty did what he always did. He plugged in. The song they chose was a strange, gloomy track called Heartbreak Hotel. It was based on a suicide note. It had no chorus in the traditional sense. It was atmospheric and weird. The RCA producers hated it. They wanted something upbeat. They wanted shake, rattle, and roll. But Elvis insisted on the mood, and Scotty built the room. Listen to the guitar on Heartbreak Hotel. It is a masterpiece of minimalism. Scotty doesn't play a melody. He plays a texture. He plays a harsh, biting double stop that mimics the sound of a slamming door or perhaps the stab of a knife. It is the loneliest sound ever recorded. When it came time for the solo, Scotty didn't show off. He played a disjointed, stumbling line that sounded like a drunk man walking down a dark alley. It was perfect. It captured the psychological disintegration of the lyrics. When the record was released, it didn't just go to number one. It changed the molecular structure of pop culture. It was the song that made John Lennon, Paul McCartney, Keith Richards, and Robert Plant pick up guitars. They didn't hear a pop song, they heard a threat. And the menace came from Scotty Moore's fingers. With Heartbreak Hotel, Elvis Presley became the most famous man on the planet. The money began to pour in like a tidal wave. Merchandise, TV appearances, movie deals. The Colonel was a genius at monetization. But here lies the dark heart of the story. In the old days of 1954, they split the money 50-50, 50% for Elvis, 50% for Scotty and Bill to share. It was a partnership. When the Colonel took over, the contracts were rewritten. Elvis was the star. The Colonel was the manager. Scotty Moore and Bill Black were employees. By many accounts, the sidemen's pay stayed modest compared with the money pouring in, and the paperwork rarely favored the players who weren't the star. Let that sink in. In 1956, Elvis Presley was generating millions of dollars. He was buying Cadillacs for strangers. He was purchasing Graceland. And the man who created the sound, the man who drove the car, the man who taught him how to be a professional, was making $200 a week. Scotty felt the sting. He wasn't a greedy man, but he was a proud one. He saw the entourage growing, the Memphis Mafia, a group of hangers-on and cousins who did nothing but light Elvis's cigars and laugh at his jokes. They were on the payroll. They were getting jewelry and cars. Scotty and Bill were getting a paycheck that barely covered their hotel bills. The brotherhood began to fray. On the road, Elvis traveled in a separate limousine. He stayed on a different floor of the hotel. The Colonel enforced a strict segregation. He didn't want the help fraternizing with the talent. He wanted Elvis isolated, dependent only on him. Scotty watched his friend disappear. The shy boy who sat in the passenger seat of the Chevy, talking about comic books, was gone. In his place was a golden idol surrounded by a wall of sycophants. And yet on stage the connection remained. It was the only place the Colonel couldn't go. When the curtain went up and the screaming started, Elvis would look to his right. He would lock eyes with Scotty. For those 45 minutes, the hierarchy dissolved. They were just two boys from Tennessee making a noise that terrified the adults. But the moment the last chord faded, the wall came back up. Elvis would be whisked away by police escort. Scotty would pack his own amplifier, coil his own cables, and go find a sandwich. By the end of 1956, the exhaustion was setting in. They had played hundreds of shows. They had recorded 2 albums. They had been on the Ed Sullivan Show. They had conquered the world. But Scotty Moore was tired. He was tired of the screaming. He was tired of the disrespect. He was tired of seeing the Colonel's cigar smoke billowing in the dressing room, counting stacks of cash while the band was told there was no budget for a per diem. He looked at Bill Black. Bill, the happy-go-lucky clown, was losing his smile. The stress was eating at him. They were the architects of a kingdom they were not allowed to inhabit. One night, Late in 1956, sitting in a motel room in some nameless town, Scotty took his guitar out of the case. He polished the gold finish. He looked at his hands, the calloused fingertips that had played Mystery Train, Good Rockin' Tonight, Hound Dog. He realized then that he had made a terrible mistake. He had built a machine that was too powerful to control, and he realized that in the eyes of the industry, he was just a mechanic. And mechanics are replaceable. He was wrong, of course. He wasn't replaceable. But the tragedy was that Elvis and the Colonel were about to try to prove that he was. The silence between the two friends was growing louder. The phone calls from Elvis stopped coming. The shared meals stopped happening. The U.S. had become him. And as 1957 approached, Scotty Moore began to wonder if it was time to put the guitar down and walk away. He didn't know that the biggest insult was yet to come. He didn't know that he would soon be forced to resign from the band he helped to build, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't afford to stay. The rocket had left the atmosphere, but the booster stage was falling back to Earth, burning up on re-entry. The years 1954 to 1956 were a blur of motion, a fevered dream of white lines on asphalt and flash bulbs popping in the dark. In retrospect, this was the only time it was real. Before the movies, before the jumpsuits, before the drugs, there was just the music. Scotty Moore would carry the memory of those days like a secret stone in his pocket for the rest of his life. He remembered the smell of the Chevy. He remembered the way Elvis laughed before the world told him who he was supposed to be. He remembered the sound of three instruments locking together in a perfect accidental geometry. They say you can never go home again. For Scotty, home was that car, and the car was parked. The passengers had gotten out, and the driver was left alone with the map, wondering where he had made the wrong turn. The year 1957 began with the roar of an engine and the scream of a jet. But for Scotty Moore, it began with a long look at a ledger that didn't balance. By this point, the cultural phenomenon known as Elvis Presley had become a sovereign nation. It had its own economy, its own laws, and its own dictator in Colonel Tom Parker. Elvis was no longer just a singer. He was an industry. He was selling lipstick, hats, and millions of records. He was purchasing Graceland, a mansion that would become the American Versailles. But the men who built the foundation of this palace were still living in the servants' quarters. Part 3 of this story is not about the music, though the music was still revolutionary. It is about the most dangerous force in the entertainment industry, leverage. It is the story of two men who tried to stand up to a tank with nothing but their self-respect, and how the tank rolled right over them. It is difficult to comprehend the financial disparity that existed in 1957. To the public, the Blue Moon Boys were a unit. They appeared together in movies like Loving You and Jailhouse Rock. They stood shoulder to shoulder on album covers. But the reality was a caste system. By late 1956, Elvis was commanding eye-watering TV money, including a widely reported $50,000 deal for multiple appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show. They had no merchandising points. They paid for their own meals, their own laundry, and the maintenance of their own instruments. The math was brutal. After taxes and travel expenses, Scotty was barely making a middle-class wage. He was the most famous guitarist in the world, yet he was driving a used car and worrying about his utility bills. The resentment began to curdle. It wasn't jealousy of Elvis. Scotty loved Elvis like a brother and believed he deserved the lion's share. It was the lack of dignity. It was the feeling of being treated like a piece of rented furniture. The breaking point came in late August 1957. The Colonel had booked a massive tour of the West Coast. The itinerary was grueling. The crowds were expected to be riotous, and the colonel refused to raise their pay. Scotty and Bill drove to a diner, sat in a booth, and drank coffee until it went cold. They looked at each other. They didn't need to speak. They knew. If they didn't stand up now, they never would. They drafted a letter of resignation. It was polite, professional, and devastatingly final. "We are not able to make a living on the present wage," they wrote. "We wish to give our 2 weeks' notice." They delivered the news not to the colonel, who they knew would just blow cigar smoke in their faces, but to Elvis. They wanted their friend to know. They hoped, perhaps naively, that the boy who used to share hamburgers with them in the back of the Chevy would step up. They hoped Elvis would say, "No, I need my guys, pay them." But the boy was gone. The king read the letter, his face darkening with a mixture of hurt and confusion. He didn't fight for them. He didn't fire the colonel. He simply retreated behind the wall of the Memphis Mafia. "If you want to leave," Elvis said, his voice thick with a sudden defensive coldness, "I'm not going to stop you." And just like that, the architects walked away. For the next few weeks, Elvis tried to prove a point. He tried to prove that he was the machine and they were just the tires. He played a homecoming show in Tupelo, Mississippi, a massive emotional event. He hired other musicians. Hank Garland, a brilliant Nashville guitarist, stepped in. DJ Fontana, the drummer who had wisely stayed on the payroll, kept the beat. But something was missing. You can hear it in the bootleg recordings of that era. The technical proficiency was there, but the telepathy was gone. Hank Garland was a virtuoso, but he didn't know how Elvis breathed. He didn't know how to wait for the hiccup in Elvis's voice. The safety net was gone, and for the first time, Elvis looked lonely on stage. The colonel, ever the pragmatist, realized that the sound was part of the brand. He couldn't sell a defective product. He approached Scotty and Bill with a deal. It was a masterclass in humiliation. He offered to hire them back, but on a per diem basis. They would be paid strictly for the days they worked. No retainer, no promises. They were effectively demoted from salaried employees to day laborers. Scotty Moore swallowed his pride. He had a family. He had bills. He loved the music. He accepted the terms. But the brotherhood was dead. He returned to the studio not as a bandmate, but as a hired gun. The tension in the studio during the recording of Jailhouse Rock was palpable. The joy of the Sun sessions, the spontaneity, the laughter, was replaced by a grim professionalism. Yet remarkably, the anger fueled the music. Listen to the opening chord of Jailhouse Rock. It is 2 jagged slashes of distortion. It sounds like a prison break. Scotty Moore wasn't playing with finesse. He was playing with aggression. He was attacking the guitar. The sessions were productive, but the dynamic had shifted permanently. Elvis was now surrounded by a phalanx of yes men, guys who lit his cigarettes, laughed too loud at his jokes, and shielded him from reality. Scotty and Bill sat in the corner tuning their instruments, outsiders in the room they had helped build. Elvis would occasionally look at Scotty, a flicker of the old affection in his eyes, but the colonel was always watching. The colonel was the gatekeeper. He made sure the separation was physical and psychological. Then came the letter from Uncle Sam. In 1958, Elvis Presley was drafted into the U.S. Army. It was a cultural earthquake. The colonel, seeing a PR opportunity, orchestrated it as a patriotic spectacle. Elvis would serve as a regular soldier. He would go to Germany. He would cut his hair. For Elvis, the army was a strange mix of hardship and relief. It took him away from the spotlight, but it also took him away from his mother Gladys, who died shortly after his induction. Her death broke him in a way that nothing else ever would. For Scotty Moore, Elvis's departure was a sudden unemployment notice. With Elvis in Germany for 2 years, the Elvis Presley machine shut down its touring division. Parker's cut and control grew over time, and the inner circle tightened around Elvis. He was 27 years old. He was the most famous guitarist in rock and roll, and he had to find a job. This is the period where Scotty Moore proved his mettle. He didn't wallow. He didn't go to the press. He went to work. He moved deeper into the Nashville studio scene. He started a record label, Fernwood Records. He produced a hit record, Tragedy by Thomas Wayne. He proved that he was more than just Elvis's guitar player. He was a producer, an engineer, a man with ears. He bought a partnership in a studio. He learned how to cut tape, how to position microphones, how to run a business. While Elvis was driving a tank in Friedberg, Germany, Scotty was building a life that didn't depend on the whims of Colonel Parker. He was regaining his autonomy, but deep down, he was waiting. Everyone was waiting. The question hung in the air. When Elvis comes back, will it be the same? Elvis returned in March 1960. The world held its breath. The Colonel booked a recording session immediately. The Elvis is Back sessions. The studio was packed. The RCA executives were there. The Memphis Mafia was there, larger and louder than ever. When Elvis walked in, he looked different. He was fitter, leaner, but his eyes were harder. He had discovered amphetamines in the army to stay awake on guard duty. He had lost his mother. He was no longer the innocent boy from Tupelo. Scotty was there, waiting with his Gibson Super 400. The session was a triumph of technique. They recorded Stuck on You, Fever, Reconsider Baby. The music was sleek. It was polished. Elvis's voice was richer, more operatic. But for Scotty, it was a strange experience. He wasn't the bandleader anymore. He wasn't even the primary guitar player on some tracks. The session was crowded with other Nashville cats. He fit in where he could, playing tasteful fills, laying down the groove. On Reconsider Baby, however, the old magic flared up one last time. It was a blues track, a throwback to the Sundays. Elvis grabbed an acoustic guitar. He looked at Scotty. "Now play the blues, Scotty," he muttered, and Scotty played. He played a solo that was thick, dirty, and full of the grit that had been missing from the polished pop tracks. For 3 minutes, the room disappeared. It was just the two of them again. But as soon as the red light went off, the spell broke. The Colonel stepped in to discuss the release schedule. The Mafia crowded around Elvis to light his cigar. Scotty packed up his guitar and went home to his wife. The final nail in the coffin of the live band came in March 1961. Elvis had stopped touring. The Colonel had decided that movies were the future. Why tour for peanuts when you can make $1 million standing in front of a camera in Hollywood? But there was one last obligation: a benefit concert for the USS Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. It was a chaotic affair. The screaming was so loud it was physically painful. The band hadn't rehearsed enough. They were playing on a boxing ring stage, surrounded by thousands of hysterical fans. Scotty Moore stood there in a gold lame jacket that felt ridiculous, playing the old hits: Heartbreak Hotel, Hound Dog. He looked at Elvis. Elvis was manic, feeding off the energy, but he was also distant. He was performing at the audience, not for them. When the show ended, there was no after party for the band. Elvis was whisked away to a helicopter. Scotty stood on the stage, unplugging his amplifier as the crowd dispersed. He didn't know it then, but he would not play live with Elvis Presley again for 7 years. The touring band was dissolved. Elvis went to Hollywood to make 31 movies, most of them terrible. He entered a bubble of isolation so thick that reality couldn't penetrate it. Scotty went back to Nashville. He put his guitar in the case and focused on his studio. He became a studiocrat. He worked with Dolly Parton, with Ringo Starr, with Jerry Lee Lewis. He became a legend in the industry, the guy you called when you wanted that sound. But a part of him remained in 1955 on a dark highway in a 1951 Chevy, laughing with a truck driver and a bass player. Bill Black died in 1965 of a brain tumor. He was only 39. Elvis didn't come to the funeral. He was afraid the crowds would disrupt the service. He sent a card. Scotty sat in the pew, looking at the casket of his rhythm partner. He realized then that the Blue Moon Boys were truly gone. The triangle was broken. He was the last man standing, and the silence was deafening. The years between 1961 and 1968 are often called the lost years for Elvis. He was lost in bad scripts and bad songs, singing Do the Clam, while the Beatles were rewriting the rule book of rock and roll, a rule book Scotty helped write. For Scotty, these were years of quiet dignity. He watched from afar as his friend became a caricature. He watched the British invasion bands cite him as their hero. He watched the world change. He never called Elvis. He figured if the king wanted him, he knew the number. The phone didn't ring. Not for 7 years, but history has a way of circling back. The movies stopped making money. The Colonel ran out of tricks. And Elvis, desperate and drowning in his own irrelevance, finally remembered the man who taught him how to rock. In 1968, the phone finally rang. "Scotty," the voice said, "it's Elvis. I'm doing a TV special. I want you there." Scotty didn't hesitate. He didn't ask about the money. He didn't ask about the Colonel. He just said, "Tell me when and where." The craftsman went home. The machine kept printing money without him. If the 1950s were the explosion and the early 1960s were the slow suffocation, then 1968 was the final desperate gasp for air. The world outside the studio walls was burning. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated in Memphis, just miles from where the story began. Robert Kennedy was dead. American cities were in flames. The Vietnam War was tearing the generational fabric apart. And in the middle of this cultural hurricane stood Elvis Presley, a 33-year-old man who looked and felt like a relic from a forgotten civilization. He had spent the last 7 years trapped in the amber of Hollywood, making movies that were indistinguishable from one another. He was rich, he was famous, and he was creatively bankrupt. To the counterculture, the kids listening to Hendrix, The Doors, and Cream, Elvis was a joke. He was the establishment. He was the guy in the bad wig singing to a clam. But desperation is a powerful fuel. In June 1968, with his career on the brink of irrelevance, Elvis signed on for a television special on NBC. The Colonel wanted a Christmas show. He wanted Elvis in a cardigan, singing Silent Night next to a fireplace. But the producer, a young rebel named Steve Binder, had a different idea. He wanted to peel back the layers of varnish. He wanted to find the animal that had been caged since 1958. Binder asked Elvis, "What do you do when you're just hanging out? What do you do for fun?" Elvis shrugged. "We just sit around and jam, me and the boys." Binder's eyes lit up. "That," he said, "that's what we're going to film." And so the call went out to Nashville. The phone rang in Scotty Moore's studio. It had been 7 years since they had played a note together. 7 years of silence. But when the voice on the other end asked if he would come to Burbank to play with Elvis, Scotty didn't hesitate. He packed his guitar case. He called DJ Fontana. The mechanic was coming back to fix the machine. The sit-down show, as it came to be known, was filmed in a small, intimate studio at NBC. The stage was a 10 by 10 foot square, designed to look like a boxing ring. The audience sat knee to knee with the performers. When Scotty Moore walked onto that stage, the air in the room changed. He was older now. His hairline was receding. He wore a contemporary turtleneck. He carried a different guitar, a Gibson Super 400, a massive jazz instrument with a deep, resonant tone. Then Elvis walked out. He was dressed in black leather from head to toe. He looked dangerous. He looked like a panther that had been starved for a decade. But if you look closely at the footage, you can see the terror in his eyes. Elvis was petrified. He hadn't performed live in front of an audience in 7 years. He was terrified that they would laugh at him. He was terrified that he had lost it. He sat down. He looked to his left. He saw DJ Fontana beating a rhythm on a guitar case. He looked to his right. He saw Scotty. Scotty Moore sat calmly tuning his guitar, looking at Elvis with that same steady, grounding gaze he had in the 1951 Chevy. He gave a small nod. "I'm here. I've got you." The fear drained out of Elvis's face. He grabbed the microphone. "You ready, Scotty?" he asked. "Ready," Scotty replied. What followed was not a performance, it was an exorcism. They launched into "That's All Right." It was the song that started it all, but this version was different. The 1954 version was bright and eager. The 1968 version was heavy, swampy, and aggressive. Scotty's guitar wasn't the clean, country-picking sound of the Sun years. It was thick and distorted, biting through the air. For the next hour, the years melted away. The Colonel vanished. The movies vanished. The money vanished. It was just the boys. Elvis was electric. He was sweating, laughing, teasing Scotty. "He's the man who taught me everything," Elvis told the crowd, pointing at Scotty, and then he started blaming it on me. The audience laughed. It was an inside joke, a glimpse into the intimacy that had been severed. During Lawdy Miss Claudie, Elvis looked at Scotty with a gaze of pure, unadulterated adoration. He needed Scotty's approval. When Scotty nailed a solo, Elvis screamed, "Yeah, play it!" He was a fan again. For Scotty, the moment was bittersweet. He was enjoying the groove. God, he missed that groove. There is a specific pocket that happens when Elvis's rhythm guitar locks with Scotty's lead and DJ's beat. It's a heartbeat. But Scotty also knew, with the cynical wisdom of a man who had been burned before, that this was likely a mirage. The highlight came when Elvis took Scotty's electric guitar and started to play it himself. Elvis was a competent player, but he was clumsy compared to the master. He handed it back. "You play it, man," he said. "I can't make it talk like you." When the taping ended, the energy in the room was nuclear. They had done it. They had proven that the king wasn't dead. He had just been sleeping. The scene backstage was jubilant. Elvis was toweling off the sweat, high on the adrenaline. He grabbed Scotty's shoulder. "We're going to do this again," Elvis promised, his eyes wide and sincere. "We're going to tour, just us. Small places, no big orchestras, just the rhythm section, like the old days." Scotty wanted to believe him. DJ wanted to believe him. For a moment, it seemed possible. The chemistry was undeniable. The critics were going to rave. Why wouldn't they do it? "I'm ready when you are, E," Scotty said. "Just say the word." They shook hands. Elvis went off with his entourage to celebrate. Scotty packed up his Super 400. He went back to his hotel. He waited for the call. He waited through July. He waited through August. The call never came. The Colonel had seen the show too, but he didn't see a return to roots. He saw a marketing angle. He saw that Elvis was back, and if Elvis was back, he could be sold to the highest bidder. The Colonel didn't want a small tour with the old boys. That didn't make money. He wanted Vegas. He wanted the International Hotel. He wanted a 30-piece orchestra, backing singers, and a spectacle. And he certainly didn't want Scotty Moore and DJ Fontana. They were reminders of the past. They were reminders of a time when Elvis had equals. In Vegas, Elvis was to be a god, and gods don't have friends. They have worshipers. When Elvis returned to the stage in 1969 for his first residency in Las Vegas, he didn't bring Scotty. He hired James Burton, a fantastic guitarist, a legend in his own right. Burton was a professional. He played what he was told. He didn't have the history. He didn't look at Elvis and see the truck driver. He saw the boss. Scotty read about the Vegas shows in the newspaper. He read about the jumpsuits. He read about the orchestra. He understood, The dressing room promise was just talk. It was the adrenaline speaking. The machine had taken over again. This was the final heartbreak. It wasn't about the money anymore, though the money was astronomical. It was about the erasure. Elvis had looked him in the eye and said, "I need you." And then he walked away without even a goodbye. The 1970s were a decade of slow-motion horror. Scotty Moore stayed in Nashville. He built a quiet, respectable life. He became a premier engineer. He worked on television shows. He was a man of the 9 to 5, a man of technical precision. He rarely spoke about Elvis. If people asked, he would say, "He's doing his thing, I'm doing mine." But he watched. He watched the news clips. He saw his friends swell up. He saw the sweat turn from the healthy glow of 1968 to the greasy sheen of pharmaceuticals. He saw the jumpsuits get gaudier, the karate moves get slower, the eyes get glassy. He heard the stories from the road, the tantrums, the canceled shows, the doctors with their black bags. It was a slow suicide broadcast on national television. There's a profound loneliness in watching someone you love destroy themselves from a distance, knowing you have the one thing that might save them, the truth, but being barred from the room. Scotty Moore was the anchor Elvis needed, but the ship had cut the chain. Occasionally, mutual friends would pass messages. "Elvis asked about you," someone would say. Scotty would nod. "Tell him I'm here." But Elvis never called. Perhaps he was ashamed. Perhaps he knew that if he looked into Scotty's eyes, those flat, honest Navy eyes, he would see the reflection of what he had become, and he couldn't bear it. Scotty was the mirror of his innocence, and Elvis had smashed the mirror. The end came on a Tuesday afternoon. Scotty was at work in his studio in Nashville. The phone rang. It was a friend from Memphis. "Scotty," the voice said, shaking. "He's gone." Scotty didn't have to ask who. He knew. The inevitability of it had been hanging over them for years. "Elvis?" "Yeah. They found him in the bathroom, heart failure." Scotty Moore didn't scream. He didn't cry out. He sat down in his engineer's chair. He looked at the mixing board. He lit a cigarette. The memories didn't flood back in a chaotic rush. They came in a single, clear image. The 1951 Chevy, the highway, the sun coming up over the Mississippi Delta, Elvis asleep in the passenger seat, his mouth open, looking like a baby. The boy who just wanted to buy his mama a house. The king was dead at 42. Scotty was 45. They were supposed to grow old together. They were supposed to be sitting on a porch somewhere, laughing about the time the colonel fell in the mud. Scotty went home early that day. He turned off the TV. He didn't want to see the circus. He didn't want to see the crying fans at the gates of Graceland. Fans who loved the image, but didn't know the man. He didn't go to the funeral. The press asked why. "I didn't want to be part of the spectacle," he said later. "I said my goodbye a long time ago." But the truth was more complicated. He didn't go because he knew he would be treated as a guest, not a brother. He would have to stand behind the ropes while the Memphis Mafia, the enablers who had watched him die, sat in the front row. He couldn't stomach it. Instead, Scotty Moore did what he always did. He kept working. He kept the silence. The death of Elvis Presley was the end of the story for the world, but it was the beginning of the afterlife for Scotty Moore. The source of the signal was gone, but the echo was just beginning to bounce off the canyon walls. For 20 years, Scotty had been the guy who used to play with Elvis. Now, he was the last survivor. The world would soon come knocking on his door, asking for stories, asking for pieces of the legend. But as the 1970s faded into the 1980s, Scotty Moore would have to face one final battle. It wasn't against grief, and it wasn't against obscurity. It was against the very industry that he had helped create. The king was dead, but the accountants were still alive, and they still owed him money. The guitar case was closed, but the ledger was still open. When the funeral procession for Elvis Presley wound its way down Elvis Presley Boulevard in August 1977, watched by a weeping world, Scotty Moore was sitting in his living room in Nashville, watching the silence. The king was dead. The carnival tents were being folded. The Memphis Mafia was scrambling to write tell-all books and auction off their proximity to fame. But Scotty didn't write a book. He didn't sell his stories to the tabloids. He did what he had always done. He went back to work. The final act of Scotty Moore's life was not a tragedy of destruction like Elvis's. It was a slow, quiet battle for dignity. It was a period of belated vindication, where the world finally wiped the dust off the history books and realized who had actually written the words. But it was also a period of profound irony, where the man who invented the sound of rock and roll had to sell his tools just to keep the lights on. He sold it to a collector. For most of the 1980s, Scotty Moore was a ghost in the machine. To the general public, he was a trivia answer. But to the musicians who had taken over the world, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, he was Prometheus. He was the one who stole fire from the gods and gave it to the mortals. As the classic rock era matured, a new generation of guitar gods began to speak up. Guitarists who came after, including Keith Richards, have long pointed to Scotty Moore as one of the true architects of the rock guitar language. This was the shift. The narrative began to change from Elvis the genius to Elvis the catalyst. People started to listen to the records again, not for the voice, but for the engine. They heard the slap-back echo. They heard the sharp, stinging leads. They realized that without Scotty, Hound Dog was just a novelty song. In 2000, the ultimate validation arrived. Scotty Moore was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but even this triumph was laced with the old poison of the hierarchy. In 2000, Moore was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with a musical excellence honor, the kind of recognition that says essential without ever saying star. Even in the museum built to honor his noise, he was still asked to use the service entrance. Yet, when he stood on that podium balding, wearing a tuxedo that looked uncomfortable on his frame, he didn't look bitter. He looked like a grandfather accepting a gold watch for 50 years at the factory. He thanked the fans. He thanked the king. He didn't mention the money, but the money, or the lack of it, was the shadow that refused to leave. Throughout the 90s and 2000s, as the Elvis estate generated hundreds of millions of dollars a year in licensing, tourism, and sales, Scotty Moore was fighting for scraps. The original contracts, those terrible documents signed under the Colonel's cigar smoke, were ironclad. Scotty had signed away his rights for a weekly wage. It is one of the great injustices of music history. Every time Jailhouse Rock was played in a movie, or a commercial, or on the radio, the cash register rang for RCA and the Presley estate. It did not ring for Scotty Moore. By the early 2000s, Scotty's health was failing. He had arthritis. The hands that had built the throne were stiffening. He needed money for medical bills. He needed a safety net. In a move that breaks the heart of anyone who loves music, Scotty Moore decided to sell his guitars. In later years, he let go of prized guitars, including a Super 400 associated with that era, a bittersweet reminder that legacy doesn't automatically mean security. Imagine the psychological weight of that transaction. This wasn't just an instrument, it was Excalibur. It was the physical link to the moment he changed the world, and he had to trade it for liquidity. He didn't complain about it publicly. He was a pragmatist. It's just wood and wire, he might have said. But the symbolism was devastating. The architect was selling his blueprints to pay for the heating. In his final years, Scotty retreated to a secluded home in Tennessee. He stopped playing. I can't make it do what I want it to do anymore, he said of his hands. If he couldn't play with the precision of 1954, he wouldn't play at all. He became a recluse, but not an unhappy one. He had friends, he had a porch, he had the quiet. He watched as the other survivors passed away. Sam Phillips died in 2003. The world was getting emptier. Journalists would occasionally make the pilgrimage to his door. They expected to find a bitter old man railing against the industry. Instead, they found a gentleman. Scotty would offer them coffee. He would talk about engineering. He would talk about the weather. When they asked about Elvis, his face would soften. He never spoke of the drugs, the women, or the decline. He protected Elvis in death the way he protected him in the parking lots of 1955. He was a good boy, Scotty would say. He just got lost. It was a profound act of grace. The man who had every right to burn the legacy down chose instead to polish it. Scotty Moore died on June 28, 2016. He was 84 years old. He didn't die on a toilet like the king. He didn't die in a plane crash like the rockers who followed him. He died quietly, in his home, effectively of old age. The engine just stopped running. The news didn't stop the world like Elvis's death had. There were no weeping crowds in the streets, but among the musicians, the silence was deafening. Paul McCartney tweeted. Jimmy Page wrote a tribute. The fraternity of guitar players lowered their flags. They knew that the DNA of their instrument had just left the building. To truly understand the end of this story, you have to go back to the beginning. Go back to that night in July 1954. The humidity, the smell of the studio, the moment before the first note was struck. When Scotty Moore hit the strings on That's All Right, he threw a stone into the lake of history. The splash was immediate. It created Elvis. It created rock and roll. It created the youth culture. But the splash is gone now. Elvis is a face on a coffee mug. The studio is a museum. The Cadillac is a tourist attraction. What remains are the ripples. History, in its purest form, is not about the dates. It is about the consequences. The consequence of Scotty Moore's life is the sound of the modern world. Every time a kid in a garage plugs a cheap Fender into a loud amp and strikes a power chord, that is Scotty Moore. Every time a band locks into a groove that makes a room full of people turn their heads, that is Scotty Moore. He was the man behind the curtain, yes, but he was also the man who built the curtain and the stage and the theater itself. He was never paid what he was worth. He was never given the crown. But crowns are heavy and they tarnish. The sound is stainless. In the end, the silence of Scotty Moore was not an emptiness. It was the silence of a craftsman who has finished his work, put his tools back in the box, and turned off the lights, knowing that the structure he built will stand forever. The singer has left the stage. The colonel has counted the money. But if you listen closely to the wind blowing through the Tennessee hills, you can still hear it. A sharp, stinging guitar line, a slap-back echo, a train coming down the track. The mechanic has gone home, but the machine is still running.